Picture this. It's 1884, and you're standing on what will one day become some of the most productive agricultural land in America. But right now you're looking at a death sentence written in dust and desperation. The Texas Panhandle stretched out before ranchers like a promise that had been broken, a contract with nature that someone had torn up and scattered to the wind. For 3 years, 3 entire years, not a single substantial storm had crossed these plains. Think about that for a moment. 3 years without meaningful rain in a place where your livelihood, your family's survival, literally everything you owned, depended on water falling from the sky. In our modern world, we turn a handle and water flows. We flip a switch and lights come on. But imagine your entire world slowly dying of thirst while you watched, powerless. The cattle that had made this region's reputation were walking skeletons by 1885, wells that had served families. For generations, wells dug by grandfathers who had fought Comanche and carved civilization from wilderness, these wells ran bone dry. You could drop a stone down some of them and count to 20 before hearing it hit bottom. The Ogallala Aquifer lay beneath their feet like a buried ocean, but it might as well have been on the moon. 300 feet down through limestone and clay, far beyond the reach of any conventional drilling technology these ranchers could afford. So what happened? What happens when an entire way of life simply stops working? Ranch after ranch went up for sale. And who was there, waiting like a vulture with deep pockets and patient money? Baron Wilhelm Hutchinson, a German immigrant who had made his fortune in Chicago beef processing, and now saw opportunity where others saw only ruin. 10 cents on the dollar. That's what a lifetime of backbreaking work was worth when the rains stopped coming. But here's where our story gets interesting. While his neighbors were packing wagons and abandoning dreams, Jake Morrison stood on Comanche Ridge that October morning in 1885, watching another dust devil spin across Tom Patterson's abandoned ranch. Now, most men would have seen that swirling column of dirt as just another reminder of nature's cruelty. Morrison saw something else entirely. You see, Morrison had spent 5 years driving cattle to Nebraska, and during those long journeys, he had seen something that stuck in his mind, like a burr on a saddle blanket. Danish immigrants up north were pumping water with strange wooden towers that caught the wind. Windmills. While his Texas neighbors cursed the relentless wind that dried their land and drove tumbleweeds across their dead pastures, Morrison remembered those spinning blades in Nebraska. The same wind that was driving everyone else away whispered opportunity to him. Think about the psychology of that moment. Everyone around you is failing, everyone is giving up, and you're looking at the very force that's destroying your neighbors' lives and thinking, maybe I can make this work for me instead of against me. That takes a special kind of mind, doesn't it? The kind that sees possibility where others see only problems. That evening at the Last Chance Saloon in Amarillo, and yes, that was actually its name, which tells you something about the mood in those days. Morrison made what would become known as his famous wager. Picture the scene: oil lamps flickering, the smell of whiskey and tobacco smoke, and 47 witnesses crowding around as this weather-beaten rancher stands up and makes the most audacious bet anyone in those parts had ever heard. Morrison bet his remaining 80 head of cattle everything he had left in the world that he could pull water from 300 feet down using nothing but the wind. 300 feet! Using wind! The laughter that erupted could be heard from the street. Grown men were wiping tears from their eyes. Baron Hutchinson himself, this sophisticated European businessman, bought drinks for everyone in the house, raising his glass to toast the fool who thinks he can make the wind work like a mule. But here's what those laughing men didn't know. Morrison hadn't just seen windmills in Nebraska, he had been studying them. While other cowboys were spending their evenings playing cards or visiting painted ladies, Morrison had been asking questions. How did those gears work? What made some windmills more efficient than others? How deep could they realistically pump? And Morrison had allies they didn't know about. Sarah Chen, the Chinese-American schoolteacher who kept meticulous records of everything that happened in their little corner of nowhere, wrote in her diary about Morrison's evening visits to her father. Old Chen had been a railroad engineer before settling in Texas, and he knew something about machinery that went far beyond what most frontier folks understood. Secret lessons in mathematics, in gear ratios, in understanding how wind resistance could be converted into mechanical advantage. There was also Maria Gonzalez, the local curandera, the healing woman who served as doctor, midwife, and keeper of practical wisdom for the Mexican families in the area. Maria blessed Morrison's work, but more than that, she shared Apache knowledge about reading wind patterns. Where did the wind blow strongest? Where was it most consistent? This wasn't superstition. This was generations of practical observation about the natural world, knowledge that Morrison would incorporate into choosing the perfect site for his windmill. So while Baron Hutchinson's men were still chuckling about the crazy cowboy who thought he could harness the wind, Morrison was already planning. He was already building relationships with the few people who believed in impossible things. He was already taking the first steps toward proving that sometimes the most ridiculous idea in the room turns out to be the only one that works. But building a windmill in 1885 Texas wasn't just about engineering and determination. It was about surviving what was coming next. The sabotage, the violence, and the kind of opposition that could get a man killed for having the audacity to succeed where others had failed. Because in the American West, there was nothing more dangerous than being right when powerful people needed you to be wrong. Winter in the Texas Panhandle has always been a brutal teacher, but the winter of 1885 taught Jake Morrison lessons he never expected to learn. While his neighbors huddled around fires burning furniture because firewood had become too precious, Morrison was out there in the howling wind and driving sleet, building something that most people thought was impossible. His first windmill rose slowly, board by board, bolt by bolt. Working alongside him were two men who had their own reasons for believing in impossible things: Samuel and Moses Washington, former slaves who had stayed in Texas after the war because, as Samuel put it, a man's got to make his stand somewhere, and this land's as good as any for proving what he's worth. But from the very beginning, Morrison faced more than just the technical challenges of engineering. Someone wanted him to fail, and they weren't being subtle about it. Cut support wires appeared overnight like spider webs that had been sliced by invisible knives. Parts that Morrison had carefully crafted or ordered from back east simply vanished. The water holes where he kept his work horses were poisoned with salt, forcing him to haul water from miles away just to keep his animals alive. The Hutchinson ranch hands made no secret of their midnight rides past Morrison's property. Picture these men, armed and arrogant, circling his construction site like wolves around a wounded deer. They never quite crossed the line into open violence, but the message was clear. Some people had too, how much invested in Morrison's failure to let him succeed quietly. The engineering challenges proved even more daunting than the human opposition. Morrison's first tower, 20 feet of carefully planned timber and steel, collapsed during a blue norther that brought 60-mile-per-hour winds screaming across the plains. Think about watching months of work, months of hope, crumble in minutes. The sound of splintering wood and twisted metal must have been like hearing his dreams break apart in real time. His second attempt made it further, much further. The tower stood, the mechanism turned, and for a few glorious weeks it looked like Morrison might actually pull this off, until he hit solid rock at 150 feet down. The main shaft, stressed beyond its limits by the constant grinding against limestone, snapped like a matchstick. The distinctive sound of metal failure echoed across the panhandle, and Baron Hutchinson's men could be heard celebrating from half a mile away. But here's where Morrison's character really shows itself. Lesser men would have quit. Hell, most reasonable men would have quit. Morrison had already lost more money than most cowboys saw in 5 years. He had been mocked, sabotaged, and beaten down by both nature and his fellow man. But instead of packing up, he went looking for help. Dutch blacksmith Hans Kowalski had been one of the few men in Amarillo who didn't laugh at Morrison's original wager. Kowalski understood metal the way other men understood horses or cattle. When Morrison showed up at his forge with the broken shaft, Kowalski studied it like a doctor examining a patient. "Your problem," he said in his thick accent, is "You're thinking like a cowboy when you need to think like a railroad man." Together, they designed a new shaft based on railroad axles, massive, over-engineered pieces of steel that could handle the tremendous stress of constant rotation under load. It cost Morrison his last 20 head of cattle to pay for the materials, but Kowalski worked through the night to forge something that could withstand whatever the wind and the earth could throw at it. The breakthrough came during the Great Dust Storm of March 1886. Now, if you've never experienced a real dust storm, let me paint you a picture. Imagine the sky turning brown at noon, darkness so complete that you can't see your hand in front of your face, static electricity crackling through the air, lightning without thunder, and wind that doesn't just blow, it screams. Most sensible people took shelter, but Morrison was out there in the howling darkness, climbing his half-built tower to secure loose blades that threatened to tear the entire structure apart. Sarah Chen watched from the schoolhouse, probably thinking she was witnessing either the bravest or the most foolish act she'd ever seen. Lightning struck all around him while he worked by feel in the blinding dust, his hands guided only by months of familiarity with every bolt and beam. When the storm cleared the next morning and the sun broke through the settling dust, Morrison's windmill stood intact. More than intact, it was working. Water, clear and cold and impossible, was flowing from 300 feet beneath the earth. The sound of that water hitting the collection trough was like music, like church bells, like the answer to every prayer that had been whispered during 3 years of drought. Word of the first successful pump spread like wildfire across the panhandle. Within days, Morrison faced a challenge he hadn't anticipated. Success brought its own dangers. Baron Hutchinson arrived with 20 armed men, and his claim was as audacious as it was legally questionable. The wind above Morrison's land, Hutchinson declared, belonged to whoever controlled the surrounding property. After all, air moved, it didn't stay put like water or minerals. Therefore, Morrison was stealing Hutchinson's wind. The 3-day siege that followed entered frontier legend. Morrison's allies, the Washington brothers, Hans Kowalski, and surprisingly, Sheriff Miguel Santos, held the windmill, while lawyers in Austin frantically researched the legal status of moving air. Can you imagine that scene? Armed men facing off over the right to harness something as intangible as wind, while in the state capital, legal scholars dug through law books, trying to find precedent for who owns the sky. Morrison himself spent those 3 days atop his windmill, rifle in hand, watching the sun glint off his spinning blades while Hutchinson's men circled below like Indians around a wagon train. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The old ways of taking what you wanted by force versus the new ways of making something from nothing through ingenuity and persistence. Sheriff Santos later said that watching Morrison up there, silhouetted against the sky with his creation turning steadily beside him, was like seeing the future taking its stand against the past. The water kept flowing, the blades kept turning, and slowly but surely, public opinion began to shift. Maybe the crazy cowboy wasn't so crazy after all. Maybe the man everyone had laughed at was actually the smartest person in the room. But winning this battle would only be the beginning, because once Morrison proved that wind could be turned into water, every desperate rancher, every ambitious speculator, and every dreamer with more hope than sense was going to want their own piece of the sky. The Panhandle was about to experience something unprecedented, a gold rush where the treasure was invisible, and the tools to claim it had to be built from scratch by people who were making up the rules as they went along. Victory in court sparked something unprecedented across the Texas Panhandle, the world's first wind rush. Not gold, not silver, not oil, but the invisible force that had been blowing across these plains since time began suddenly became the most valuable commodity in the American West. And Jake Morrison, the man everyone had called crazy just months before, found himself sitting at the center of a transformation that would reshape how humanity itself thought about the frontier. Morrison could have done what most successful inventors do, patent his improvements to the European windmill designs, charge licensing fees, and become rich by controlling access to the technology. Instead, he made a decision that revealed the kind of man he really was. He offered to teach any small rancher his methods in exchange for 1% of their water production for 10 years. 1%. Not 10, not 20, just enough to sustain his operation and help the next desperate farmer get started. This decision created something remarkable. A network of allies spread across 5 counties, each one with a vested interest in Morrison's continued success. More importantly, it denied his enemies easy access to the technology. You couldn't just steal Morrison's designs anymore. You needed his knowledge, his experience, and his willingness to share it. But human nature being what it is, plenty of people tried to shortcut their way to success. The scramble to copy Morrison's achievement produced some spectacular failures that became the stuff of Panhandle legend. Rancher Jim Thornton, convinced he could improve on Morrison's design, decided to double the blade size without understanding the physics involved. When his massive windmill caught a strong gust, it didn't just break, it exploded, sending wooden shrapnel half a mile in every direction. Thornton's prize bull was killed by a flying blade tip, and pieces of his windmill were found embedded in trees 3 counties away. The Hutchinson Syndicate, determined to prove that money could solve any problem, imported a massive steel windmill from Chicago. This mechanical marvel cost more than most ranches, stood 60 feet tall, and looked like it could pump water from hell itself. It lasted exactly 1 month before sinking into the sandy soil and toppling like a felled tree. Turns out Eastern engineers didn't understand Western wind patterns, and certainly didn't understand the unique challenges of Texas geology. These disasters only increased demand for Morrison's expertise. By summer of 1887, he had more requests for help than he could handle, and that's when the real trouble started. Because while water sources like creeks and rivers had centuries of established law behind them, wind rights remained completely undefined. Who owned the air above your land? How high did your property rights extend? What happened when 2 people claimed the same wind? The competition for prime wind sites triggered what became known as the Skeleton Creek Range War. Rattlesnake Butte, the highest point in 3 counties, attracted 2 different groups of would-be windmill builders. The Clearwater Consortium, led by former Union officer Captain James Mitchell, claimed the site based on their surveying work and formal application to the territorial government. The Brazos Group, fronted by Confederate veteran Colonel Robert Hayes, argued that their livestock had been using the area for water and therefore established prior claim. When legal arguments failed, gunfire settled what courts couldn't. The shootout at Rattlesnake Butte lasted 3 days and left 7 men dead, including both Mitchell and Hayes. Picture that scene. Grown men killing each other over the right to build something that caught the wind. It sounds almost absurd until you realize what was really at stake, the difference between prosperity and starvation, between staying on the land your family had died for and joining the exodus of broken dreams heading back east. Governor Sewell Ross finally sent Texas Rangers to establish wind claim procedures, but even they struggled with the fundamental question, how do you regulate something you can't see, fence, or control? The Rangers' solution was typically pragmatic and thoroughly Texan, first come, first served. But you had to actually build a working windmill within 6 months to hold your claim. No speculation, no land grabbing, you had to prove you could make the wind work for you. Morrison navigated these conflicts by doing something that revealed his genius for leadership. He organized the Panhandle Windmill Cooperative. Instead of competing against each other, member ranchers shared knowledge, standardized parts, and most importantly, presented a united front against outside speculators who wanted to control the technology without understanding the land. The cooperative's first convention in Amarillo drew attendees from 5 states and Mexico. Picture that gathering. Weathered ranchers rubbing shoulders with mechanical engineers from Chicago, Mexican vaqueros comparing notes with Danish immigrants, former slaves working alongside Confederate veterans, all united by their shared belief that human ingenuity could triumph over natural limitations. Maria Gonzalez opened the gathering with a blessing that became part of windmill folklore. She compared windmills to prayer wheels, constantly turning humanity's hopes skyward, connecting earth and air in an endless cycle of aspiration. The wind, she said, belongs to no man and serves every man who respects its power." Her words were translated into 6 languages and carved into the beam of Morrison's original windmill. But the cooperative was more than just philosophy and good intentions. It was a practical response to practical problems. Standardized parts meant that a gear manufactured in Amarillo could repair a windmill in Lubbock. Shared knowledge meant that innovations developed on one ranch quickly spread to others. And the united front meant that when outside interests tried to muscle in, they faced not just individual resistance, but organized opposition. The Hutchinson Syndicate made one last attempt to control the windmill industry by buying up all the steel suppliers within 500 miles. Their plan was simple: create a monopoly on materials and force the cooperative members to either pay extortionate prices or abandon their windmills. What they didn't count on was the ingenuity of people who had learned to make something from nothing. Morrison and Hans Kowalski developed techniques for recycling railroad scrap, turning abandoned track and broken axles into windmill components. Samuel Washington discovered that certain combinations of local woods, properly treated, could serve almost as well as imported steel for many applications. Within months, the cooperative had not just survived Hutchinson's monopoly attempt, they had made it irrelevant. By the end of 1887, the transformation was visible from horizon to horizon. Where once there had been empty plains marked only by abandoned ranches and weathered bones, now dozens of windmills turned steadily in the constant breeze. Each one represented not just water and survival, but a fundamental shift in how people thought about their relationship with the natural world. Morrison's original windmill still stood at the center of it all, its blades spinning with the steady rhythm that had become the heartbeat of a new way of life. But the real victory wasn't just technological, it was social. The cooperative had proven that people could work together to solve problems that no individual could tackle alone. In a region where independence was religion and self-reliance was scripture, Morrison had created something unprecedented: voluntary cooperation that made everyone stronger. But as 1888 dawned, Morrison and his allies faced their greatest challenge yet. Success had attracted attention from far beyond the Texas Panhandle, and powerful interests were mobilizing to either control or destroy what the windmill pioneers had built. The real test of their revolution was just beginning. 20 years. That's all it took to transform the Texas Panhandle from dying rangeland to agricultural powerhouse, from a place people fled to a destination that drew settlers from around the world. By 1905, over 12,000 windmills dotted the landscape from the Canadian River to the Pecos, their spinning blades creating a symphony of progress that could be heard for miles on a quiet morning. Morrison's original tower still stood at the heart of it all, maintained by the town as a monument to the radical idea that persistence could triumph over mockery. Every spring, Sarah Chen brought her students there to tell the story of the man who refused to accept that the wind was his enemy. She would point to the weathered wooden blades, still turning after 2 decades, and remind them that every impossible thing starts with someone willing to be laughed at. But the transformation went far beyond just pulling water from the ground. Once you could harness the wind for one purpose, ingenious minds found dozens of others. Windmill-powered grain mills began processing wheat and corn grown on previously useless land. Cotton gins powered by prairie winds processed crops that had never grown in West Texas before. Some enterprising inventors even developed wind-powered electrical generators, bringing electric lights to communities that had never seen anything brighter than oil lamps. The social changes were even more profound than the technological ones. Women no longer spent half their day hauling water from distant wells or rationing every drop for cooking and cleaning. That liberation of time and energy led to transformations no one had anticipated. Mary Hutchinson, the Baron's own daughter, who had grown up watching her father mock Morrison's dreams, used her freed time to open the region's first lending library. Knowledge, like water, began flowing more freely. The reliable water supply enabled truck farming, bringing fresh vegetables to a diet that had consisted mainly of beef and beans for generations. Children who had grown up thinking that lettuce and tomatoes were exotic luxuries from the East suddenly had gardens behind their houses. The health improvements were dramatic. Scurvy and other deficiency diseases virtually disappeared from communities with successful windmill cooperatives. Morrison's influence reached far beyond the borders of Texas. Australian ranchers facing similar drought conditions copied his designs for the vast expanses of the outback. Argentine gauchos on the pampas, South African farmers on the veldt, Russian settlers on the steppes, all found inspiration in the story of the Texas cowboy who made the wind work like a hired hand. The boy who neighbors had called Wind-Touched Jake had changed how humanity itself related to the frontier. Emperor Meiji's modernizers in Japan studied Morrison's cooperative model as a way to organize rural development without creating the kind of social upheaval that had torn apart other traditional societies. The idea that technological progress could come from the bottom up, driven by practical need rather than imposed from above, challenged assumptions about how societies modernize, but perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in the people themselves. The Panhandle had always attracted independent spirits, but the windmill revolution created something new, a community of innovators who understood that individual success depended on collective knowledge. The old frontier mentality of every man for himself gave way to something more sophisticated, a recognition that the most complex challenges required cooperation. Morrison himself remained at the center of this transformation, but he never forgot the lessons of his early struggles. He continued to live simply, in the same modest house he had built during the drought years. When reporters from eastern newspapers came to interview the famous windmill king, they were often surprised to find him working alongside his hired hands, his clothes dusty and his hands calloused from actual labor. "The wind doesn't care if you're rich or poor," Morrison told a journalist from the New York Times in 1903. "It'll work for anyone willing to understand its ways and respect its power. The moment you start thinking you've conquered it, that's when it'll remind you who's really in charge." The Baron Wilhelm Hutchinson lived long enough to see his grand schemes crumble, while Morrison's simple approach flourished. By 1900, most of the Hutchinson syndicate's massive investments had failed, while the small ranchers who had joined Morrison's cooperative prospered. The Baron himself, perhaps mellowed by age and repeated failure, eventually joined the cooperative and publicly praised Morrison's vision. "I spent my life trying to impose my will on this land," Hutchinson said at the cooperative's 10th anniversary celebration. "Jake Morrison understood something I was too proud to learn, that success comes from working with the land, not against it." The end came as Morrison had lived serving others. In November 1908, an early blizzard struck the Panhandle with unusual fury. Temperatures dropped 40 degrees in 2 hours, and winds that had once brought hope now brought mortal danger. Ben Patterson's cattle water windmill suffered critical damage, and without repair, his livestock faced death by dehydration even as ice formed on every surface. 70-year-old Morrison didn't hesitate. While younger men debated whether the risk was worth it, Morrison climbed the damaged windmill in sub-zero temperatures and howling wind. Working by feel in the blinding snow, he managed to complete the repairs that would save Patterson's herd. But the effort proved too much for a body that had endured decades of frontier hardship. They found him at dawn, tools still in his hand, frozen in place like a guardian watching over the land he had saved. The spinning blades of his own windmill created a gentle rhythm above his still form, a final salute from the wind that had been his partner for over 20 years. Baron Hutchinson himself led the funeral procession, confessing publicly that mocking Morrison's vision remained his life's greatest regret. Thousands attended the service, coming from as far away as California and Mexico, to honor the man who had proven that innovation could triumph over opposition, that cooperation could overcome competition, and that sometimes the most ridiculous idea in the room turns out to be the only one that works. Morrison's grave marker bore a simple inscription: "He listened to the wind." But his real monument was everywhere across the Panhandle, thousands of spinning wheels that continued their ancient dance with the air, pulling life from the depths of the earth, proving every day that human ingenuity and natural forces could work together rather than against each other. The boy, they had called Wind-Touched Jake, had touched far more than the wind. He had touched the future itself, showing the world that progress didn't have to come at nature's expense, that communities could innovate together, and that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin with a single person willing to stand up and say, "I think we've been looking at this all wrong." Today, when you drive across the Texas Panhandle and see modern wind turbines stretching to the horizon, generating electricity for millions of homes, remember that it all started with one stubborn cowboy who refused to accept that the wind was his enemy. Jake Morrison proved that the difference between disaster and opportunity often comes down to a simple question. Are you going to fight the wind, or are you going to make it work for you? The answer, blowing across the plains of Texas and spreading around the world, continues to spin in the endless dance between human dreams and natural forces, between what is and what could be, between the way things have always been done and the way they might be done better.